Well, he's clearly very, very desperate, Brianna. The fact that they're conducting this mobilization reflects a dynamic on the battlefield in Ukraine that is inescapable and I think irreversible. It is that Ukraine has done a vastly better job at mobilizing its country for a war. So now a country that's 1/3 the size of Russia has a larger army. It's much better equipped thanks to the U.S. and other NATO countries. The U.S. now over $15 billion of arms and ammunition. It's organized these forces and now it's employing them very effectively, taking back territory that Russia seized since 24 February and threatening to do it again in the east. There's another city that's about to be encircled from which the Russians will have to withdraw. The Russians have taken huge losses, many multiples already just in the 7 months of this war, compared with nearly a decade in Afghanistan. Putin is unable to provide the number of replacements. That's why he has taken this really quite desperate step, which he really didn't want to take, because he knew that there would be demonstrations. He knew there would be this kind of exodus from the country of military-age males, fearing that they would be conscripted, even if they don't meet the criteria of this mobilization. As your reporter noted, the shambolic way in which this mobilization has been carried out and very highly criticized by Russian citizens. So he's in a very, very tough spot. And again, I don't think that the numbers that he will gather with this particular mobilization will result in adding well-trained, physically fit, qualified, coherent units that can withstand the Ukrainian offensives that will go on. It may be that they can plug a hole here or there, but it appears fairly inevitable that the Ukrainians are going to continue to take back territory, and they could take all the way back to what began on 24 February when Russia launched this unprovoked invasion. Well, assuming that we continue to arm and equip and fund them as we have and as our NATO and Western allies have, and keep in mind that this could be a cold winter in Europe with the gas flow disrupted and so forth, but assuming that we continue to support them, and I think we will, I believe we should very strongly believe that, I think they can continue to take ground. The winter is not going to slow the Ukrainians down as much as individuals predict. They're on their own soil. They're fighting for their own security. This is their war of independence, if you will. Their morale is now sky high. Russian morale is very low. And if we start to see Russian units begin to crumble and then perhaps in some areas even collapse, which is not out of the question, I think you could see Ukrainian forces roll this all the way back, at least to some of the major strongholds, the major cities that Russia will have taken, which will be just as difficult for the Ukrainians to take as they were for the Russians, given the challenges of urban combat. But over the months ahead, there is going to be continued momentum by the Ukrainians. The Russians will be desperate to try to hold that back. That's the reason for this mobilization. That's the reason for Putin's threats of use of nuclear weapons and so forth. I don't think that is going to happen, although we need to be concerned about it. And of course, our U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has openly said that the U.S. has communicated with Russia about what would result from use, which would not actually reverse the situation on the battlefield. It can't change this terrible dynamic for Putin, which is that Ukraine has done vastly better at recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and now employing forces than Russia has. Yes, I think probably that is the case. They have the technical expertise, the knowledge of the pipelines, all the rest of that capability. And clearly what they're trying to do, again, is to force Europe to force Ukraine to seek some kind of negotiated resolution. Now, I think there will be a negotiated resolution at some time. President Zelensky has said that this is how this will ultimately end. The question is, where will Ukraine and Russia be on that battlefield when the time comes for that? And I would also note here that I think we need to be thinking ahead to that moment. Again, many, many months, perhaps longer from that particular point. But we need to be thinking about what kind of security guarantee we and our NATO allies would provide for Ukraine, because to make a negotiated resolution durable and to give confidence to outside investors and to whatever Marshall Plan kind of support will be provided, there will need to be an ironclad security agreement for Ukraine this time, noting that in the past we've been reluctant because we were concerned about Putin's sentiments on NATO expansion. Well, that did not work out. We should be very blunt with him about that and say that will not be the case this time. We will provide a security guarantee and ensure that it is enforced.
It is significant, but it's also desperate. He is losing. And the battlefield reality he faces is, I think, irreversible. In other words, over the last 7 months, President Zelensky and Ukraine have mobilized vastly better than has Russia. In other words, Ukraine has recruited, trained, equipped, organized, and employed forces incomparably better than Russia has. And the reality facing Russia now is that Ukraine, a country a third the size of Russia, has a bigger, much more effective army on the ground and other assets as well. All of this, of course, supported by the arsenal of democracy. The United States now up to $17 billion, over another billion announced this week, in military arms, ammunition, and materiel, and also supported by the other NATO countries and other Western countries around the world. So he faces a situation that I think, again, is irreversible. There's no amount of shambolic mobilization, which is the only way to describe it, no amount of annexation, no amount of even veiled nuclear threats can actually get him out of this particular situation. He announced the annexation, and he's already lost a really critical element in that, a critical city that would have been a very key supply hub had they been able to go farther. And that's just going to continue. He's going to continue to lose on the battlefield. And at some point, there's going to have to be recognition of that. At some point, there's going to have to be some kind of beginning of negotiations, as President Zelensky has said, will be the ultimate end. And at some point, by the way, as well, I strongly agree with the idea of Ukraine becoming part of NATO, although, as Senator Rubio noted, let's make sure that the battlefield goes well first.
But by irreversible, you mean that Russia cannot win this war?
There's nothing he can do at this point. Again, it's been many multiples in 7 months what Russia lost in nearly a decade in Afghanistan. Many, many multiples. And again, they're losing on the battlefield, and it's going to continue. The only question really is, when do you start to see not just individual soldiers or small units surrender, but when you start to see larger units crumble, crack, and perhaps actually collapse? And I think that will be coming. And then the questions for President Zelensky will be, do we retake that little part of the Donbass that was controlled by the separatists since 2014? And what about Crimea? And when do we have some kind of negotiation with Russia? And of course, by the way, in response to this annexation, Russia got hit by 100,000 more individual, personal, and other sanctions, showing that the West still has more that can be done to Russia. It can still get worse for Putin and for Russia. And even the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield won't change this at all. You have to take that seriously. And Jake Sullivan has publicly stated that the U.S. has communicated to Russia what would happen in response to that.
And what would happen?
Well, again, I have deliberately not talked to Jake about this.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you a hypothetical, we would respond by leading a NATO, a collective effort that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also in Crimea, and every ship in the Black Sea.